Succession of the Acadian Forest, Point Pleasant Park's transformation after Hurricane Juan.
Hurricane Juan hit Point Pleasant Park on September 28th and 29th in 2003, uprooting thousands of trees and dramatically changing the landscape of the park. Since 2003, there's been extensive research done on the park about how it is rebuilding after the hurricane. With lots of research done both pre and post-hurricane, lots of data points towards how well the park is doing following hurricanes. Point Pleasant Park is known as Mtukit, or Spirit Place, by Nova Scotia's Mi'kmaq. The Mi'kmaq were some of the first people to use the park to hunt, fish, and as a holding place for traditional ceremonies. It has also been found that Point Pleasant Park was not only used for the previously stated activities, but also where the spring feast ceremonies would be held, and it was a burial ground for Mi'kmaq figures of high authority along with other associates. The Point Pleasant Park can be seen as a mixed Acadian or mixed forest. Being a mixed forest constitutes being composed of red spruce, white pine, with little amounts of red maple, balsam fir, and paper birch. Within having a diverse tree range, the park also contains a unique underlying geology. The geology includes having pyritic scale, schists, and magmatite rock types. The soil is shallow, shaly loam with strong leaching action and is very acidic with a pH of 3.5 to 3.9. It also includes some podzolic and brown shaly loam soil types as well. The objective of our project was to measure the succession in Point Pleasant Park after Hurricane Juan through a series of research experiments. Some key words found throughout the presentation are DBH, distant at breast height, snag, which means dead tree, and PPP, which is Point Pleasant Park. We aimed to answer 3 research questions throughout the duration of our experiment. Research question 1 asked, how has the overall forest community changed over time and why? What can you predict will happen to the overall community as the forest moves towards its community climax and why? The null hypothesis for this question is stated as there was no change in the overall forest community from 2004 to 2023 in Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The alternative hypothesis is there was a significant change in the overall forest community from 2004 to 2023 in Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Research question 2 asked, how has the density of the dominant species in 2004 as well as the dominant species in 2023 changed over time and why? What can you predict will happen to the dominant species as the forest moves towards its community climax and why? The null hypothesis is there was no significant change of density between the dominant species from 2004 to 2023 in Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the alternative hypothesis states that there was a significant change of density between the dominant species from 2004 to 2023 in Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Research question 3 asked, how has the chosen community metric changed over time and why? What can you predict will happen to the chosen community metric as the forest moves towards its community climax and why? The null hypothesis stated there was no significant change within the Shannon diversity and species richness between 2004 to 2023 in Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The alternative hypothesis is that there was a significant change in the Shannon diversity and species richness between 2004 to 2023 in Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia.
The study site for our experiment was Point Pleasant Park, located in the south end of Halifax, Nova Scotia. There were 6 study sites measuring 20 meters by 20 meters that were interspersed around the park. The sites were chosen to ensure an unbiased, thorough cover of the park while observing parts that were heavily affected by Hurricane Juan. All living trees greater than or equal to 2.5 centimeters diameter at breast height were identified and measured using a tape measure in each of the 6 sites. Following the collection of data, linear regressions were used to analyze and address our research questions. All analysis was performed using data collected in the same 6 plots every year from 2004 to 2023, excluding 2005, 2007, and 2020. Linear regression was chosen as our form of data analysis as we were interested in analyzing one dependent variable, either density or abundance, in relation to the time following the hurricane. We used a linear regression to examine the total density of Point Pleasant Park before and after Hurricane Juan in 2003. There was a significant positive relationship between the total density of the park and the time following the hurricane, with the R-squared value being 0.54, the F statistic with degrees of freedom of 1 and 79 was 95.5, and the p-value was 3.10 times 10 to the negative 15. The regression equation was total density is equal to 9.9554 multiplied by the year minus 19,971 as seen in figure 1. There was an approximate increase of 34.4% in density from 2004 to 2023. Based on this data, we reject our null hypothesis that there would be no relationship between the total density and the year since the hurricane. As stated by Moles and Larson, during succession, the entire structure of a community is altered. Because of this, as the park community recovered from the hurricane, species began to reestablish and increase in density compared to the time of the hurricane, when 70% of the vegetation was eradicated. As Burley et al. Found, urban forests are still able to follow natural successional trends following devastating disturbances. These natural successional trends include an increase in density from the time of the disaster. However, in a study by Turchin, it was suggested that due to competition for resources, the density of the park is expected to diminish over time. Based on both of these findings, it can be assumed that as Point Pleasant Park approaches its climax, the overall community will continue to increase in density before it eventually begins to decline due to competition.
We used a linear regression to examine the change of density of the red spruce and the red maple from 2004 to 2023. There was a significant positive relationship between the density of the red spruce and the time following the hurricane, which was by 5.59%. The F statistic with 1 in 79 degrees of freedom was 9.80, with a p-value of 0.002. There was also a significant positive relationship between the density of the red maple and the time following the hurricane, which was by 32.35%. The F statistic with 1 in 79 degrees of freedom was 16.8, with a p-value of 0.0001. Based on this data, we reject our null hypothesis that there is no relationship between the density of the dominant species and the years after the hurricane. The main source of density changes of the dominant species in Point Pleasant Park, red spruce and red maple, are from disturbances like hurricanes and cyclones. Hurricane Juan in 2003 being one of the most impactful, which removed over 70% of the overall canopy. Another stressor that only affects the red spruce is the bark beetle, which led to the removal of many snags in the park and contributed to a decrease in population size, seen in Figure 2. Over time, more red maple were established as an even-age regenerated forest, indicating the early succession rates and fast growth post-disturbances, seen in Figure 3. Over time, as the forest moves towards its climax community, we would suspect the population to change due to the large establishments of red maples. Fewer of these will survive due to the intraspecific competition and the law of the minimum when considering resource uptake. Wood from the red maple is not very strong or hard, which can make it susceptible to future natural disasters due to the even age growth and lack of species richness. Later successional species better suited for the environmental conditions and resources available will eventually establish a population. The presence of species with higher shade tolerance and nearby seed sources will be the underlying factors of regeneration. To enhance the resistance against pests and storms, a diverse population and age structure is essential to minimize gaps in the canopy and preserve the Acadian forest ecosystem.
Using linear regression to analyze how both species richness and Shannon diversity changed after Hurricane Juan in 2003, we can see that both figures show a positive relationship. In Figure 5, we see the positive relationship of species richness and the years following Hurricane Juan with an R-squared value of 0.64, an F statistic value of 141.6, and a p-value of 2.2 times 10 to the power of negative 16. The regression equation species richness is 0.59 times time minus 1,180.9. In Figure 6, the positive relationship can be seen with an R-squared value of 0.36, F statistic value of 40.3, and a p-value of 1.6 times 10 to the power of negative 8. The linear regression equation for Shannon diversity is 0.069 times time minus 136.8. With all of this information, it is determined that we reject our null hypothesis that there is no relationship between species richness and Shannon diversity and the years following Hurricane Juan. We can see that both community metrics help to reach the community climax, which is when the populations hit the succession endpoint. Based off of previous research, we can analyze that this can be done from the results of a study done by Burley, Robinson, and Lundholm, which states that urban forests like Point Pleasant Park are possible that after a catastrophic disturbance, these forests can show a natural successional trajectories. Considering previous relationships, we can determine that species richness and Shannon diversity of Point Pleasant Park will increase as the population moves towards community climax.
Research from Jocham shows that in 1992, the Acadian forest in Point Pleasant Park was close to its community climax. Unfortunately, after the 2003 hurricane, the park was no longer near its climax and lost more than half of its canopy. Over time, urban park succession can be affected by many factors, some being anthropogenic, like a higher concentration of CO2 from cars in the city that causes stress on the trees, or interference of the natural nutrient cycling from the removal of deadwood, but are not limited to this, since it was found that the abundance of squirrels in Point Pleasant Park also affect the succession by eating seeds needed to regenerate different species in the forest and increase richness. Disturbances are needed to diversify the community, to open the canopy and allow later successional species to establish and remove competition pressure. Since 2008, over 100,000 trees have been replanted with the intentions of restoring the Acadian mixed forest. It is known that the Mi'kmaq people and all other indigenous have a special relationship to the environment and especially trees. Two-eyed seeing is a term that explains the difference between the indigenous perspective and the Western colonial perspective. It is a process that is heavily reliant on research, planning, and asking permission before taking action. The second eye is emphasized as looking again or re-researching through traditional knowledge from their community. The Mi'kmaq worldview is one of interconnectedness, and all that is done is with the environment and sustainability in mind. The Mi'kmaq see themselves as one with the ecological community, which is something the colonial view needs to keep into consideration when dealing with these communities. We would like to thank Dr. Alison Schmidt for all the hard work she put into this experiment and for supplying us with the data needed to create this project. We would also like to acknowledge the past ecology students from prior years who have collected the data over many years that we used and analyzed.